I start working. Okay.
Should I? No.
No, even panelists are not here. Where the hell they are?
Yeah, they are that side.
Huh? Okay, rapporteur is here. So, and then after this, you also give the floor to
Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen,
Just continue.
the chairperson of the meeting has another engagement, and
Okay, apparently we can't hear.
huh?
It's not here. It's saying we can't hear. I don't know.
Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, the chairperson of the meeting has another engagement and has asked me to continue the meeting on recognition. I still have many speakers, around 20, on my list, but unfortunately, due to time constraints, I will only give the floor to 5 of them now, and then give the floor to our panelists to respond to some questions and final comments. I will ask them to be brief so that we can move on to the next panel on justice. Time permitting, at the end of the panel on justice, I will reopen the general debate on recognition and try to accommodate the rest of the speakers on my list who wanted to speak on the issue of recognition. I would like to inform you that the list of speakers for the panel on recognition is now closed, and the list of the panel on justice will close in 10 minutes, and the list for the panel on development will close at 4 p.m. Before I give the floor to the next speaker, I would like to invite Fernando Chironda to address this meeting on behalf of the 2017 Fellowship Program for People of African Descent. Thank you, sir. Is Fernando...
Fernando, you see you.
Yeah, I'm here. Thanks, sir. Good morning, good afternoon, chairperson and estimated participants. I would like to thank you for this opportunity. I'm Fernando Chironda from Mozambique, living in Italy, representing the UN Fellows of the People of African Descent 2017, a program of human rights advocates run by the Office of Human Rights Commission for Human Rights. We would like to bring to your attention the following issue concerning human rights violations occurring worldwide, with particular focus on migrants and people of African descent. We would like to remind you that most of the state parties have ratified several core human rights treaties, such as the ICCPR, the CAT, the ICER, and the ICESCR, as well as the respective protocols which obligate states to respect, protect, and fulfill the human rights of all persons within their territories. As you may be aware, instability and violence adversely affecting people of African descent around the world. The situation has resulted in massive internal displacement of people of African descent globally. Armed groups across many countries remain the most powerful actors on the ground, contributing to insecurity and human rights abuse. Within this frame, migrants and people of African descent are highly vulnerable to arbitrary detentions, inhuman conditions, torture, and other ill treatments, sexual violence, extortion, trafficking, and human slavery. These human rights violations are carried out in total contrast to national and international human rights standards. As recently stated by the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights regarding one of the countries impacted, the suffering of migrants detained is an outrage to our conscience outrage to the conscience of humanity. As fellows of people of African descent, we remind all the UN member states represented here that slavery and slave trade is a crime against humanity and should be prohibited in its all forms. To ensure that the rights of the people of African descent are protected, we would like to encourage the Human Rights Council to ensure that effective measures are adopted and protected, respect and fulfill the right of people of African descent. Moreover, we encourage special procedure mandate holders, in particular, the special rapporteur on trafficking in person, the special rapporteur on the human rights of migrants, and the special rapporteur on minority issue, as well as other international and regional human rights mechanisms to monitor closely the situation of people of African descent, migrants, and other vulnerable groups, and to propose measures that will ensure the enjoyment of human rights and the fundamental principles of equality and non-discrimination. We invite you, all member states, to effectively eradicate all forms of slavery by addressing the root cause of slavery. Over the next 2 days, and through the decade of people of African descent, let us utilize our knowledge and the collective address this issue and formulate strategies to improve the status of people of African descent. Finally, we remind all states represented here about their responsibilities to fulfill the Sustainable Development Goals in order to better transform our world without leaving anyone behind. We thank you for your attention.
I now give the floor to Uganda Diaspora Europe on my list. You have 2 minutes. Could you kindly raise your hand so that the cameraman can be able to see you? Your 2 minutes starts now.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On behalf of Uganda Diaspora Europe, we appeal to the states that the International Decade for Africa, people of African descent should be put in national policies and should be implemented not only on documents. We are concerned that some people from African descent are not up to now aware about the decades. So it's very important that states should make it simpler for the people, the street people, the local people of African descent should know that this kind of things exist. It should not remain in parliaments, it should not remain in municipalities, but should trickle down and should always ensure that everyone has his or her right brought out. Of course, I reside in the Netherlands. There are a lot of things that which needs to be brought in, but there's a gap between the people of African descent and the government. Because of this gap, we appeal to the government of the Netherlands to bring it more and make it a little bit more simpler for the local people to understand so that they can work together and fight for the rights of the people of African descent. I thank you.
Thank you much. I now call upon Le Collectif Africain. Please raise your hand.
Okay. Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Chairman, we are soon going to be celebrating the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. What is the actual panorama today in 2017? How are people of African descent treated and perceived in the world, particularly in Europe, as slaves, criminals, commodities, second-class citizens, a poster to promote humanitarian activities in Africa, a fashion trend which spotlights our costumes, our music, our apparel, or our food? The dehumanization of persons of African descent, above all of black people, is nothing new. It started long ago. Recent tragic events which have been spotlighted by the media in North Africa recall to what extent colonial history still is marking our present-day lives. It is not by announcing the reception of dozens in the media and even hundreds or thousands of African migrants to enhance the reputation of a European state that human tragedies such as those we see in the Mediterranean are going to stop. What happens to migrants once they are in Europe? Are they treated like fully fledged human beings? What is the impact of negative coverage by the media of subjects relating to migration involving persons of African descent who are European citizens and have been for 2 or several generations or 3? We want justice, but justice which condemns and rights the wrongs committed by slavery, colonialism, and neocolonialism. The Collectif Africain notes with great regret that few European countries have launched the program of activities for the decade. Switzerland, of which I am a citizen, officially launched the decade, but it has not been sufficiently spotlighted, and the scope of the work to be carried out in the implementation of this program is considerable. In this context, the establishment of an international standing forum for persons of African descent and the national commemoration in each year of something similar to the Black History Month of the United States and Canada, more adapted to the European context, but also the establishment of an internet platform within which associations of the African diaspora could interact with public authorities are necessary and even vital to cope with Afrophobia, which prevails in Europe. Thank you. Thank you.
On my list is the International Human Rights Association for American Minorities. Please identify yourself. To the right. Please go ahead. Your 2 minutes starts now.
Yes, Chair and fellow delegates, on behalf of the International Human Rights Association of American Minorities, NGO and consultant status with USCO, we are happy to present. We also have an affiliate core planning group for historically black colleges and universities, development CPG-OH-BCUD in the United States of America. Ever since an inaugural investigation of the UN Special Rapporteur, Honorable Maurice Gilele, we see these same type of problems being present in terms of people of African descent in the United States. Unfortunately, and now full recognition of the United Nations studies shows that this pervasive oppression continues in all manners of social life. And we are asking that we look at the fundamental contradiction that these unequal statistics are connected to unequal access, is connected to unequal treatment, but all this is really founded upon unequal access, unequal status, based upon the fact as a national minority we have not been recognized, even in the United States Constitution, Article 13, can be no more than an invitation to citizenship. It cannot be forced upon us, which is in fact a form of forced assimilation. So we ask that we will be recognized. We ask that we will be recognized as a national minority, such that the United States will sign on all the international treaties so we can have the fundamental thing which is called equal status. Thank you so very much.
Next on my list is Aging People in Prison and Prison Human Rights Campaign. Please identify yourself.
Hi, can you hear me? That's it right here. Hi. I hold it the whole time. Okay, sorry about that. Hello, good afternoon. My name is Tomoko Shine. I am a cultural anthropologist, and I founded the organization called Aging People in Prison, Human Rights Campaign. We advocate to get people out who've been in prison in North America for 30, 40, 50, the longest is 64 years, incarcerated. I began to study this by looking at the system of white supremacy. I look at identities and behaviors that fall out of this. In particular, what led me to the work of prison work was looking at the black-on-black violence and where this comes from. This led me to see that people of African descent as a collective would be classified as what is called ethnocide. This was a term coined by Robert Jolin some time ago, and ethnocide is defined as a systematic destruction of the thought and the way of life and people different from those who carry out this enterprise of destruction. In other words, genocide kills the body, but ethnocide kills them in their spirit. So some of the things that I found as I did my work, and particularly working with those in prison in North America, these are the descendants of those that were enslaved, these Africans brought here, is that we have various examples. I remember working with a young person, 7 years old, asked him what he wanted to be when he grew up. He said he would probably grow up to go to prison like his father. We have women who are serving 30, 40, 50 years and dying in prison. Their children are growing up their entire lives without their mothers. We also have young women in the focus groups I've done who are saying that they do not want to have a black son because they are afraid because of the violence that they've seen over the last few years. So the ultimate is when a group begins to kill and destroy itself, and this again is what we would call ethnocide. And thus we have generational trauma that continues to be passed down. In other words, we have a group that ran from death that now they are running to death. So under this term of this platform of recognition, the people of African descent, these descendants need to be recognized so they can begin to be protected, because right now they are being killed at will and being imprisoned at will for decades. I will encourage the body of African descent, the working group, and the decade to begin to establish research centers, satellites in the different countries that are dealing with people of African descent, the descendants, to begin to study what has occurred to us and to begin to gather data. One book was written by Vernelia Randall, Dying to be Black, talks about this. Also needs to be a massive re-education needs to be done to place the people of African descent within human society. This has not been done. What falls out of the system of white supremacy are identities and roles of young people, where young people who are of African descent are being killed, and these people, young people who are considered white, are doing the killing. And this is because we have not dealt with the system of white supremacy and began to disassemble it and began to dismantle it. So again, under the platform of recognition, compensatory and reparatory justice, reparations, has to be dealt with so this group can begin to be placed within human context once again. I thank you for your time.
I'm really sorry to cut you off. We are really running against time. We started very late. At this point in time, I would like to invite the panelists for the theme on justice to come and join me. Ms. Hannah Shukoka, Mr. Mamadou Jallo, Ms. Deborah Coles, Mr. Louis Georges Tin, Dr. Rebecca Del Sol. Please come up. Should I go there or should I?
No, you're fine here.
Okay. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, one of the themes of the International Decade for People of African Descent is justice. Access to justice is a core fundamental right and a central concept in the broader field of justice. Access to justice is a basic principle of the rule of law. In the absence of access to justice, people are unable to have their voices heard. They cannot exercise their rights. They cannot challenge discrimination or hold decision makers accountable. The right to access to justice ensures equality before the law, and the emphasis on equal justice or equal access to justice for all, including members of vulnerable groups, is of paramount importance to the justice discourse. Access to justice is more than just improving an individual's access to courts and guaranteeing legal representation. Some have defined the access to justice as the ability of people to seek and obtain a remedy through formal and informal institutions of justice for grievance in compliance with human standards. Among other things, there is no access to justice where a particular group fear the system, where that particular group see it as an alien and not to access it, and where the justice system is financially inaccessible. The International Decade provides measures which states should take in order to ensure access to justice. At this point in time, I would like to briefly introduce the panel. The panelists before you. The first to go will be Hannah Shukoka. Hannah Shukoka is a professor at Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznan, and she's also the chair of the Constitutional Law. She's a member of Parliament she was a member of Parliament from 1980 to 1985 in opposition. In 1989, elected as a solidarity candidate to Parliament, and then again as member of Democratic Union till 2001. From 1992 to 1993, she was Prime Minister of the Republic of Poland. From 1997 to 2000, she served as Minister of Justice and Attorney General. Since 2001 till 2013, was Ambassador of the Republic of Poland to the Holy See. She is also a member of the parliamentary delegation of the Republic of Poland to the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, Vice Chairperson of the Assembly between January and October 1992, and for many years since 1991 to 2016 as a member of the Venice Commission. In 2015, she became first Vice President of the Venice Commission. In June 2016, she was honorary President of the Venice Commission. Hannah Shukoka is also a member of the group of 5 eminent persons to follow up the implementation of the Declaration and Program of Action of the 2001 World Conference Against Racism. At this point in time, I would like to invite Hannah to take the podium.
Yes, we can speak from here.
You can speak from here.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. President. And as I said, probably the presentation was longer than my speech, but I think that what is important is the last part of the... I put it on.
Yeah.
You just follow
Now, yes, and I think that what is important is the last point from this presentation, that I am here today as a representative of the independent expert of the group of independent experts on the implementation of the Durban Declaration. It is exactly for me a great pleasure to participate in this regional meeting within the framework of the International Decades for People of African Descent. As we live in extremely challenging times of an increasing number of conflicts, terrorist attacks, deteriorating socio-economic conditions, and climate changes, it seems how difficult to pause for a second and remember that after the horrors of the Second World War, we, the people of the United Nations, had committed in the preamble of the Charter to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights and the dignity and worth of the human person. And we clearly stated also in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that we recognize inherent dignity and the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family as the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. I would like to use also this occasion to recall that within the framework of the International Covenant of Human Political Rights, in its Article 26, many governments have committed to ensure that all persons are equal before the law or are entitled without any discrimination to the equal protection of the law. So, yes, this seems somewhat forgotten in the light of the increasing number of birth-related incidents in national justice systems, law enforcement institutions, and border control authorities. Almost every day, we hear about natural disaster, being then earthquakes, floods, or tornadoes, but how often do we hear about the devastating magnitude of horrible man-made disasters such as racism. Instead of being shocked and horrified from the occurrence of such incidents, they go through a process of so-called normalization. What does normalization means normalization in this context? Is it normal that an increasing number of political leaders make xenophobic statements and incite hatred? How we can see it in the light of right to justice? Is it normal that people do not feel touched by the images of drowned migrants? Is it normal that there were some numbers of young people support Nazi movements and attack those that are perceived as foreigners? Is it normal to use excessive force against young people of African descent? Is it normal to promote intensively ethnic profiling as it makes people feel protected? Finally, is it normal to allow perpetrators to walk away without any sentences and to watch victims' humiliation over the lack of effective remedies? Now more than ever, it is the time to emphasize eloquently that none of this is normal. We should do more to dismantle promptly such populistic processes of normalizations where many people are manipulated for the benefits of the few. Let's not forget that within the framework of the Sustainable Development Goals, in particular Goal 16, promote just, peaceful and inclusive societies, we have committed to significantly reduce all forms of violence and related death rates everywhere, as well as to promote the rule of law at the national and international levels and ensure equal access to justice for all. In the last few years, we have witnessed the reinforcement of anti-discrimination equality legislation in various countries, and the creation of equality of, better say, anti-discrimination bodies, both at the national and European level. Also, plausible efforts have been made towards ensuring formal equality. The main challenges remain in the realm of substantive inequality and de facto discrimination, or in other words, how do we implement these laws and politics? So I think that now the problem is how to implement it, not only making new laws. It was also strongly pointed out by Pope Francis during his visit to Africa in 2015. He spoke with feeling about the way that humans and the economies they create can contribute to injustice and severe imbalances. In some countries worldwide, people of African descent are 6 to 8 times more likely to be stopped, searched, and incarcerated. Police have also been reported to make no or little record of hate crimes, sexual violence, or other crimes aimed at people of African descent, particularly at women. On various occasions, victims have not received immediate medical attention following an attack. Furthermore, I am saddened to hear that cases of physical violence against refugees of African descent and alleged extortion by groups have been recorded in a number of Eastern countries, Eastern European countries, whilst individuals who claim to protect national borders against migrants on their own initiative are praised as heroes and defenders of their homeland. Similarly, some media have built a narrative around refugees, also of African descent, associating them to notion of disease and threat. The media has in particular played a crucial role in negative framing perceptions of refugees and migrants, and I think that is also placed in the ambience of the court and justice. Also, legal measures have a central role in the fight against racial discrimination. They are not sufficient, as I said. I would like to reiterate the importance of education and its impact on perception and behavior. Education is a very good and very important instrument also for giving and make reality a right to justice. I encourage you to try to anticipate the long-term impact of children's stories where the black duck is mistreated till it becomes a beautiful white swan, where we senselessly use idioms such as black sheep or others. Let's not forget that one day these children might become judges and police officers. I think we can all agree that much more remains to be done in the fight against racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. Battling early stereotypes and prejudice requires open and inclusive space where people's assumptions are challenged and questioned. Just by initiating such interactions, we are already nipping at the root causes of such prejudices. Thank you so much. I did some very general observations which are very important for the implementation of the right to justice.
Thank you very much. I will not try and summarize, but some of the questions that we have posed are very, very critical, whether something is normal. And I think as we move forward, we need to be asking these questions, whether something is normal to our eyes, and interrogate, that aspect. But you also touched upon the importance of implementation. We need to move beyond what is actually in the text and implement on the ground. In the interest of time, I would also like not to present to you the bios of the speakers, so that we can have more time, particularly from civil society organizations, after member states have made their interventions. At this point in time, I would like to call upon Mr. Mamadou Diallo to make his speech.
And Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, and I would say, Oshe to my brothers and sisters that are here, and Assalamu alaikum to my brothers and sisters, Muslim brothers and sisters that are here today. I want to thank you, Mr. Chair, for inviting me to speak here today on the burning issue of justice for people of African descent. As you have mentioned, I will speak today from my perspective as a political representative, as it said on the program. I'm a member of parliament, the Swedish parliament, but also as a member of civil society, a member of an organization called the Pan-African Movement for Justice, which is in Sweden, but also which is a part of a bigger network, the European Network Against Racism. Yet no matter the standpoint, central to any fight for equality for people of African descent is the call for justice. By this, I mean justice in terms of reparations for the historical injustices that we endured, but also the current injustices that we continue to endure. I mean justice in terms of accountability for the violence and discrimination and inequality that we continue to experience. And I mean justice in terms of equal access to rights, freedoms, and opportunities now and the future. I would like to speak to the outstanding structures of injustice experienced specifically by people of African descent in Europe, and then go on to what needs to happen to change. From my experience as the former chair of the Steering Committee on Afrophobia at the European Network Against Racism, INA, I would like to give that experience that I got traveling the whole of Europe, talking to people of African descent. But first, I would like to just say a few words about my organization, INA, which is one of the biggest anti-racist networks in Europe. And the Pan-African Movement, which I'm the chair of, is a part of the network. And INA, as a European network of NGOs, has been working to combat racism and related discriminations that combines advocacy and cross-community action. INA and its members, including the Pan-African Movement for Justice, have strong expertise when it comes to Afrophobia, and we have been working on the issues concerning racism against black people for many years. In 2016, INA produced the first ever pan-European comparative report on Afrophobia in the European Union, setting out the available evidence on racism experienced by people of African descent in Europe. And you may find both publications in the room, and on ENA's website. I think we have them on the table there. And I would like to share some of these findings to you, ladies and gentlemen. Afrophobia is a specific form of racism that refers to any act of violence or discrimination fueled by historical abuses and negative stereotyping and leading to the exclusion and dehumanization of people of African descent. And Afrophobia refers to anti-black racism, as some people call it, and it correlates to historically and current repressive structures of colonialism and the transatlantic enslavement. It is estimated that there are 15 million people of African descent and black Europeans in Europe. We are one of the largest minorities in Europe, and yet there is not one single European or national policy dedicated to advancing the rights of people of African descent. And yet Afrophobia is widespread, and evidence can be presented in numerous areas of public life. If you look at racist violence, for example, people of African descent and black Europeans are victims of particularly violent racist crimes. In 2009, the European Union found that 33% of sub-Saharan Africans in Europe have been victims of at least one racially motivated crime that year. In 2008, in Sweden, Afro-Swedes, Swedes with African origin, were the most exposed to hate crimes, seeing 24% increase. In 2015, a man stabbed 3 people to death, and this was qualified as a racist attack in a school. In criminal justice, we see that discriminatory policing and ethnic profiling are long-standing issues. Studies have found that in Paris, people perceived as black were overall 6 times more likely to be stopped by police than white people. In the UK, black people are 8 times more likely to be stopped and searched by the police than white people, according to the latest data. In Germany, we see a repeated denial of the fact that black people are being racially profiled. Where we have data, we see that black people are overrepresented in prison and are increasingly targeted by police by violence. In 2017 has been numerous examples of violence against black people at the hands of police, including Rashan Charles in the UK, who died in July after being restrained by the police. In February, Theo Luhakia endured a violent arrest, including sexual abuse at the hands of police in France. Further, new evidence has emerged on the devastating case of Wuri Jallow, a man who burned alive in the custody of German police. Mr. Chairman, we see these realities happen every day, and yet the people that perpetrate these crimes, they do it with impunity. Where we have data, we see this happening every day. Now, as for the outcomes in other fields of life, across all the indicators, education, health, criminal justice, and employment, black people are discriminated against, have unequal opportunities, and denied their rights every single day. This structural inequality is commonplace across the whole Europe, and yet, I repeat, there is not a single European-wide policy to address this. These findings from the INA Shadow report are just attempts to categorize the problem in the absence of systematic data. However, it shows that Afrophobia is a problem that both wide and structural, both individual and societal. The justice we seek, therefore, requires individual accountability for perpetrators of racial violence and discrimination, but also structural transformation. How do we achieve this? As signatories to the UN, member states have the obligation to ensure black people enjoy the rights to equal treatment and non-discrimination. It is high time that this situation of black people, people of African descent, receive proper recognition. Inherent to this must be a recognition of past injustices and current injustices, and steps towards reparation and restitution, which my brother here will be speaking about a bit later. Regionally, at the level of the European Union, we are calling for this in the form of an EU framework for national strategies to combat Afrophobia. In September this year, members of the European Parliament discussed the issue of Afrophobia for the first time. in an official meeting. INA presented the shadow report as an initial outline of the problem. At the national level, in line with the Durban Programme of Action, member states should adopt action plans to combat racism and specifically Afrophobia. These plans should recognize historical and current structural injustices faced by people of African descent and take concrete steps to address this. In these national action plans, member states need to include the collection of equality data based on self-identification to provide sound evidence for structural discrimination. They also need to set out a real and effective policies to address racist violence against people of African descent, but also tackle structural disadvantages experienced by people of African descent in public life. In the field of criminal justice, these plans need to ensure real justice for victims of racist violence and their families, the end of racial profiling, and the accountability of abusive behavior of state actors against our brothers and sisters by the criminal justice. And looking wider at EU-led policies on migration, we see the links between discrimination and exclusion of people of African descent in Europe and the global racism underlying the international border system. To maintain Fortress Europe, European states have profiled detaining and deporting black people back to danger. They still deport black people to Libya. We say we are horrified about the things that we see in Libya, but yet we have migration policies that make it possible for black people to be sent back to Libya. So we need to change that. I would end up by just giving an example. Some of you, or at least I think all of you, have seen the images about how our black brothers and sisters are brutalized, humanized in a way that I personally only saw, or at least read in books, about this transatlantic enslavement. We see that happening today. Before, when we spoke about it, people say that was a long time ago, so we don't remember it. But now we cannot say that because we see black people auctioned out for $800, $700, $500, sold as animals. So we cannot continue saying this was a long time ago because this is happening now. Frederick Douglass said there is no progress without struggle, but black people have been struggling a mighty long time. And I cannot say we've seen the progress that we need to see if we still auctioning out our brothers and sisters. So something needs to be done. And lastly, I would like to, in view of this, the coalition of civil society organizations that are here, we would like to recommend that the Office of the High Commissioner to work on to promote safe access to the asylum procedure in the European Union with humanitarian visas to the European Union. We would like to call on the European Union to cease externalizing responsibility for immigration control to African countries, which contribute significantly to the massive human rights violations currently taking place in Libya, Algeria, Sudan, and other places. Lastly, at all levels, we need solidarity, resources, and coordination for strong networks and coalition to tackle Afrophobia. As activists, NGOs, policymakers, we need to make the links between the experience of people of African descent across the world and find global solutions. This includes making links with the fights against other forms of racism, mobilizing in broader movements, and recognizing that all oppression is connected. Therefore, all fights for justice must be connected too. We need to see the links between the death of a man in German police custody, the exclusion faced by black and indigenous women in Latin America, to the enslavement of black people in Libya. Achieving justice for one is not enough. To conclude, following the pillars of the UN Decade for People of African Descent, recognition, justice, and development, we need recognition of the particular inequalities and racism and exclusion experienced by people of African descent. We need justice for those injustices, past and present. We need commitment, solidarity, and resources to ensure the development of people of African descent in Europe and beyond. We need this not tomorrow, not next week. We need it now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jallo. You did not only talk about the justice deficit, but you also talked about how to address those deficits that we see. And thank you very much for that. At this point in time, I would like to call upon Ms. Deborah Coles, the Director of Inquest, to make her presentation.
Thank you. And it's to be speaking on this platform. I'm going to be talking from the perspective of an NGO that for 3 decades has worked with the families of those who die in all forms of custody and detention. So that's police, prison, immigration, and deaths in mental health settings. Could you move the slide on, please? We also work on other deaths, including Hillsborough football disaster, but also the shocking events at Grenfell Tower fire. The work, however, I'm going to talk about today is our work on deaths in custody. The work with families informs all of our evidence-based research, policy and parliamentary work for social justice and change, and we try and hold the state and private companies to account for human rights violations and dangerous practices. We monitor the investigation and inquest process. An inquest is a process of inquiry that we have in England and Wales after a death in custody, held in public with a jury. And we try and hold the state to account to the rule of law. What we've monitored is the failure to properly investigate, prosecute, and sanction excessive or unlawful use of force. Families are at the heart of our work, and their campaigns, particularly the work of the United Families and Friends campaign, have been extremely important in raising the visibility of these deaths. We situate custody deaths in their broader social and political context, and many of these impact on broader policies on public health, poverty, and inequality. And of course, we have to acknowledge the legacy of enslavement and colonialism as the broader context for institutional racism, and also the current toxic discourse around Brexit and the increase in hate crime in the UK. There are a pattern of cases that are synonymous with state violence, racism, and impunity. The reason I've included some pictures of those who've died is to humanize the people who have died, the people behind the statistics. Last year, we saw the highest number of self-inflicted deaths, also known as prison suicides, in England and Wales. And a recent report into the criminal justice system saw the UK imprisoning more black people per capita than the United States. We've also seen this year the highest number of deaths in UK immigration centres on record. A third of these since 2000 have been people of African or African Caribbean backgrounds. And we obviously do need to close these centres down. I'm going to concentrate on police-related deaths, and our monitoring shows that they are not isolated individual tragedies, but part of a systemic problem and the result of structural factors. A disproportionate number of people from Black, Asian, and minority ethnic communities and those with mental health problems have died after the use of unlawful or excessive force, and these are 4 of those men. Our monitoring has shown that you're twice as likely to die following the use of force if you are from a BME background, in particular young black men, subject to deadly use of restraint and restraint equipment. Many of the cases that Inquest has worked on have presented a disturbing picture of violence and racism and inhumane attitudes towards people in distress, ascribing to black people stereotypical characteristics of extraordinary strength, dangerousness, and criminality, trying to demonize and blame the victim for their own death. the racial stereotype of the black man as big, black and dangerous, violent and volatile, when woven into police culture and practice, has led to the disproportionate and fatal use of force. Another group overrepresented are people with mental health needs, again a stereotype of the mentally ill as mad, bad and dangerous. And we're particularly concerned with the double discrimination experienced by black people with mental health needs. An obsession with dangerousness can mean that the focus becomes the risk posed by the individual to the exclusion of consideration for their welfare and safety. And we frequently hear comments at inquests about the person who has died having superhuman strength, the strongest man that they've ever come across, and being impervious to pain. And the pernicious combination of such perceptions towards black men who are also mentally ill can create situations in which the person being restrained is dehumanized and their life devalued. And this is encapsulated in the tragic and brutal death of Olusegun Lewis, a 23-year-old man in mental health crisis. He was restrained to death. 11 police officers were involved in holding down a terrified young man, shackled in 2 sets of handcuffs and 2 sets of leg restraints until his eventual collapse, whilst medical staff stood by. Although these are a small proportion of the total number of deaths, by their very nature, they are the most controversial. They connect with the black community's experience of structural racism and over-policing and criminalisation. The fatal shooting of Mark Duggan, an unarmed black man from Tottenham, a community at the sharp end of police harassment and previous police-related deaths, ignited frustration and anger and saw widespread disturbances spiral across the UK. We also saw most recently disturbances in Hackney in response to the death of Rashan Charles. For the first time, the Metropolitan Police collated and collected use of force data, and they are further illustrative of this racist and discriminatory policing. And I particularly ask you to look at the statistics on the use of what is euphemistically called a spit hood. And I think you'd all agree that it has a disturbing resonance of slavery, somebody being hooded, and look at those figures about its use, particularly against black people, but also black women. The recent deaths of 4 young black men after restraint by police officers and members of the public, and a number of negative decisions following prosecutions and disciplinary proceedings on other police-related deaths, have kept this issue on the political and community agenda. A recent publication of a government-commissioned review, the Angelini Review on Deaths in Police Custody, reinforced inquest findings and raised concerns about a lack of parity of funding and access to justice for bereaved people. The question of police conferral, the use of ex-police officers by the independent investigation body, the IPCC, a failure to investigate deaths as if a potential crime, delays in the legal processes, and a recognition about racial disproportionality. And its test will ultimately be in its implementation. Time and again, we see inquests held into these deaths, returning highly critical conclusions about unlawful, excessive or disproportionate force used. However, criminal charges are extremely rare. There has never been a successful prosecution for manslaughter and police at an individual and corporate level, and police are rarely held to account. Since 1990, there have been 9 unlawful killing verdicts or findings returned by juries at inquests and inquiries. And as I said, no successful prosecution. And this remains one of the most contentious issues and highlights significant shortcomings in the investigating, prosecuting and learning mechanisms. Police conduct which is potentially criminal is simply not subjected to the same investigative steps as criminal offences of civilians. At its core are concerns that the rule of law does not apply to the police for abuses of power in the same way as it does to the ordinary citizen. The central experience of impunity and the damage it does to victims, to public confidence and trust, and to the very fabric of the rule of law and democratic accountability cannot be overstated. The existence of effective mechanisms to tackle police misconduct is an important safeguard against ill treatment of persons deprived of their liberty, and appropriate disciplinary and/or criminal penalties can have a powerful dissuasive effect on police officers who might otherwise be minded to engage in ill treatment. The right to life is a fundamental right, and following a death there needs to be a prompt, effective and independent investigation. The UK government claims transparency and accountability for its institutions and law enforcement agencies. However, bereaved families have to fight at all stages of the process against a culture of institutional denial, delay and defensiveness. And this is anathema to accountability and frustrates the opportunity to learn from mistakes and protects those responsible for ill treatment or failings in care. And on the very rare occasions there have been criminal prosecutions, this has very much been down to the pressure brought to bear by the family, by inquest and their lawyers. The reality is, for bereaved families, too many investigations remain dysfunctional. Deaths in custody are clearly a global human rights issue, and we've seen this from the protests in the US and the UK and the Black Lives Movement to protests against Aboriginal deaths in Australia to the issues under discussion today. And it is bereaved families, human rights lawyers, civil society who have placed state agencies under public scrutiny and focused on the responsibility and culpability of custodians. So learning from our experience, what is clearly needed in any system is resources available to families for specialist help and legal representation to access justice after a custodial death, both from specialist lawyers but also from NGOs. It's important to recognise the vital role of civil society activism, which can help to impact on change. We need a robust, independent and effective investigatory body in which victims and the public can have trust. Use of force data and deaths in custody and detention need to be disaggregated by ethnicity. And we need to tackle racism and discrimination through recognition of the disproportionate number of deaths of black people following the use of force and the role of institutional racism, both within the investigation process, but other legal processes, and in terms of the police and its training. And I want to just make one quick point here about we've got to stop diluting the language around racism and discrimination. In the UK, we talk too much about unconscious bias and equality and diversity rather than naming it as it is, which is about racism. And finally, police must be held to account at both an individual and senior management level, and sanctions brought against those who abuse their powers. And we also need an oversight framework by which compliance with post-death actions and recommendations to learn from past errors, to ensure that we monitor, audit and follow up them. And vitally, we need resources for those NGOs working around the world on deaths in custody in order to bring an end to racial profiling and state and police violence. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Cole. And I think the perspective that you have taken in your presentation is very critical, looking at how to find justice for those who have departed in the most horrendous ways. And you have also provided concrete recommendations on how to best address this issue. Thank you very much for that. At this point in time, I would like to call upon Mr. Louis-Georges Tin, President Le Conseil, representative de l'Association Noire de France. Over to you, sir.
Mesdames, Messieurs, je voudrais proposer quelques réflexions générales.
Thank you. We need a microphone for the speaker. Thank you. I'd like to talk about some of the injustices of the past and the injustices today. The decade for people of African descent is one that should be for reparation. As you no doubt know, there are three topics that have been identified. Recognition, first of all, justice, development. And it is precisely all those threes that constitute reparation. Recognition, justice, development equals reparation. Reparation means that you recognize past crimes, that justice is rendered, and that is done via development policies. So we need to use this term all the time, and I'd like to pay tribute to the expert group of people of African descent who have used this term, and indeed many others, because it's absolutely vital to the cause that we are talking about today. We all know that there cannot be peace without justice. You cannot have justice without reparation. If somebody causes harm to you and you want justice, and the justice says, yes, this individual is guilty, but victim, you will not be getting any reparation, you and then are entitled to say that's not justice. Those who refuse reparations are refusing justice. Whether we like it or not, they are accomplices, tantamount to accomplices of the criminals. They are accomplices to this system of impunity. Impunity simply favors repeat offending. It's because yesterday's criminals were not punished. That is precisely why they can continue today and tomorrow. So it's not just an opinion in the area of reparations. No. Being against reparations, I believe, is tantamount to saying you're in favor of yesterday's crimes, today's crimes, and tomorrow's crimes. So we have to stand for reparations. One can discuss the ways and means, but I don't think we can discuss the principles. I'd now like to turn to the crimes of the past before I turn to crimes today. And I also recognize that this separation is rather arbitrary because yesterday's crimes do have lasting consequences on the present. But I'm just doing this to make the exercise clearer. In France, for instance, my organization, the Representative Council for Black Associations, is involved in some trials. If we're talking about justice, you have to talk about trials. The first had to do with Haiti. You might not know, but when Haiti obtained its independence on the 1st of January 1804, with the abolition of slavery, France refused its independence, and it forced the Haitian people to pay the equivalent of $21 billion at the time, from 1805 to 1946. So they had their knife to the neck, as it were. Haitians had to pay that sum precisely not to fall under the yoke of slavery again. This, if you like, dragged them down into this terrible spiral, a downward spiral of underdevelopment, poverty, economic instability, political instability, and I have to say they haven't emerged from that downward spiral yet. And I believe that this is something that therefore constitutes a basis for a trial against the French state. Forced labor in Africa is another topic. There were more slaves in France after the abolishment of slavery in the French Congo, the Belgian Congo during the colonial period. And we have taken action and proceedings to recognition that slavery, and indeed the abolition of slavery, constituted a crime against humanity. We also have taken proceedings in order to get back money that was taken from treasuries that were pillaged under the colonial period. You'll find the British Museum, for instance, the Terheven in Belgium, the Quai Branly in Paris and in Germany and elsewhere, all the spoils that are to be found in those museums. All those countries were pillaged, and this needs to be handed back. These are resolutions that it would be great to be able to take today. The President of France, back in the time, President Mitterrand said this was, impossible. But now what is impossible has become possible, which is why we now have an association to remember the period of slavery. This is something which was enabled thanks to activist associations that we brought together, and nowadays, I think we really can start addressing the subject of financial reparations in France. The city of Paris, which to date had already been against a museum, finally now a resolution is adopted which is favourable to the creation of a museum of slavery in France. So the whole issue of reparations is still on the agenda. What was impossible in the past is now possible. I've been talking about past injustices which have consequences, but there are present injustices happening as we speak, injustices as we are speaking. Several of us here said what has been happening in Libya. Crime committed there, injustice, and therefore responsibilities. And this on both flanks of the Mediterranean, in Libya, of course, but also in Europe. For instance, Frontex, France and the UK, who are engaged in an illegal war, dragging the UN, and this precipitated the chaos that we anticipated, but perhaps we couldn't even in the past have an idea of the scope that that would entail. We again are going to take legal proceedings against the people in Libya, France and the UK, because this is justice. There are courts for this, and it's very important that those people responsible for those crimes are prosecuted. Other injustices affecting people of African descent, and not only them, wage inequalities which are racial in nature. I think we all know gender inequalities. They're clear legal texts. I mean, I agree these texts need to be improved upon because we recognize that there is still a huge wage gap between men and women for equal work. But I want to talk about the racial wage gap. There is a real gap. For instance, in all countries concerned, there should be some sort of comparative situation report with indicators which allow one to establish whether for equal work there truly is equal pay, and is there equal promotion in your job, equal remuneration. So these are just some examples of tangible measures that could be taken in order to reduce the injustices that we're talking about this afternoon. Now, I'm not going to talk about police violence. That's already been mentioned. And indeed, you mentioned other topics. So I simply wanted to add to what has already been addressed this afternoon. To conclude, I'd like to make two additional recommendations on restitution, reparation, wages. I think we need to have an international conference on reparations. And indeed, what we're doing already is a start in the right direction, but we need to take this further. Michael McTrain and others have brought together several organizations which have set up a platform, or a draft rather, for a resolution. In fact, that's available in the room. And I would like to focus on what I think is the most important, the salient points of this resolution. The need to have a report on the decade not only on people of African descent, but on Africans in general. So we see exactly who is doing what. We have many European countries which signed up to the decade, but nationally they don't really budge at all. It's hypocritical. I mean, there needs to be a true assessment and monitoring so that we can see what people are saying they are doing. We don't want hypocrisy, we want sincerity here. I don't think we can just say equality is an option. Justice is a requirement. It's a necessity, not an option.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tin. From your discussion, 2 points that I took was the interdependence between the themes. And I think you said it well, that you cannot discuss anything about justice without even recognizing the person that you are meeting that justice to, which then leads to the issue of development, which is a critical aspect as well. And then the other call that you made on the conference on reparations, I think is a very important call, because when we are talking about justice, we are also talking about reparations. And on that note, I would like to call upon Dr. Rebecca Del Sol, the Program Manager, Fair and Effective Policing Project, Open Society Justice Initiative. Over to you, ma'am.
Thanks very much for the opportunity to speak today. I'm going to talk about racial profiling. And although profiling is an unlawful form of discrimination, it is too frequently justified as legitimate and even necessary in law enforcement. I will talk here about some of the drivers of racial or ethnic profiling and describe some of the challenges and good practices that the Justice Initiative has been supporting in collaboration with communities and police across Europe and elsewhere. Two of the most basic principles that underlie criminal justice are that all people are equal before the law and that all people are presumed innocent until proven guilty. Racial profiling describes what happens when police or other law enforcement agencies rely on stereotypes rather than objective facts and evidence in targeting persons for attention. Put simply, racial profiling occurs because of how people look, because of how they are, or where they worship, rather than what they've done. And in doing so, it violates these two basic principles of non-discrimination and due process in justice. Racial profiling is well understood by those on the receiving end, but it is routinely denied by the police across Europe and other countries, primarily due to the lack of ethnic data to be able to establish profiling definitively. Firstly, let us throw out the bad apples theory, that a handful of racist officers create the problem. There are racist officers, but racial profiling is a pattern of practice. It's an institutional practice, not a set of individual acts. Profiling describes a disproportionate targeting of minorities in the use of tactics such as ID checks, stops, searches, raids, surveillance, fining practices, data mining, and arrests. People of colour are policed differently to white people, and so are neighbourhoods of colour. Institutional decisions, such as the use of specific law enforcement tactics and deployment patterns, impact unequally on different ethnic groups. Counter-terrorism and concerns about border security have combined with increasing anti-immigration sentiment and have added further drivers to ethnic profiling in Europe. As we know, racial profiling exacts a high price on the individuals, the groups, the communities that are signalled out for disproportionate attention. For individuals stopped and detained, the experience, often of repeat encounters with the police, can be frightening, humiliating, and have a long-term impact on their lives. Racial profiling serves to stigmatise whole groups, contributes to the overrepresentation of ethnic minorities in other parts of the criminal justice system, legitimises racism, and fosters mistrust between communities and the police. Policing can be both fairer and more effective, and there are communities and civil society groups challenging racial profiling across Europe. To give just a few examples, today in Madrid, Spain, there is a celebration of an iconic challenge to racial profiling. 25 years ago today, Rosalind Williams was stopped by the Spanish police and told that she couldn't be Spanish because she was black. She fought this case for years, and it finally went to the UN Human Rights Committee in 2009, and they ruled in her favour. But it didn't change the constitutional law in Spain, so today there's another legal challenge to the European Court against the Spanish government for ID checks, continuing Rosalind's work and challenge. In France, a class action with 13 individuals suing the French state for racial profiling in stops was partially successful, with an acceptance that ID checks were discriminatory. The unsuccessful cases, mainly those based around area policing and institutional drivers, are being appealed to the European courts. There's a similar type of class action brought by African Australians in Melbourne, Australia over the last few years. And again, that's just been settled, and the police have instituted a pilot recording all stops and looking at ethnic profiling. In Sweden, there's communities that are organising a Twitter campaign to warn migrants that immigration stops are taking place and tell them which areas to avoid. In a range of countries, including France, the Netherlands, the UK, Switzerland and Belgium, there are coalitions or networks working together to challenge ethnic profiling through research, litigation, advocacy, campaigning and awareness raising. It's hard for the police to admit that they are profiling. Discussions of racial profiling are usually heard as accusations of racism against individual officers. Yet admitting the problem is a crucial first step, without which nothing can be done. Changing attitudes and practice in police organisations and rebuilding community relations are a long-term challenge. It requires us all to have difficult conversations about stereotypes based in race, ethnicity, religion, and the manner in which they play out in interactions with the police. Yet there are a few police forces across Europe beginning to take the first step, very small steps, but recognising the issue and introducing promising practices. So what can be done? First, legal standards must clearly prohibit discrimination in law enforcement. This should be explicitly, it's important that the laws explicitly state that ID checks should only be conducted on the grounds of reasonable suspicion. In practice, when we've worked with police forces, we've often found that officers have a hard time articulating reasonable suspicion and don't often even know the laws around stops or ID checks or fines. So it's important that legal standards must be turned into practical guidance and operational protocols and training. Police managers and line supervisors need to monitor and support the manner in which frontline officers use their powers and take action when they fail to do so correctly. Some of the best systems flag issues, offer remedial support and proceed to disciplinary action if there is evidence of repeat bias, and they must include local communities in reviewing officers' use of stops and searches and other powers. There's an interesting mechanism being developed in Northamptonshire Police in the UK, where members of the public actually vote on whether they think the police have met legal standards, and if they decide that they haven't, those officers are taken up a pyramid of disciplinary action. The basis for these good management practices lies in the data that supports them. Just as stops themselves should be intelligence-led, that is, that they should be based on real grounds for suspicion, management should be evidence-led and based on empirical patterns and empirical evidence of patterns and problems. Relatively few police services have good data on their use of ID checks or other police powers, and even fewer have ethnic data or engage with this data for any type of management of individual officers. There are understandable sensitivities around the police collecting ethnic data, but it can be done, even in countries with stringent data privacy standards. The anonymised statistics must be transparent and shared with communities, both to allay concerns about possible abuse, but most importantly, to support honest conversations between the police and local communities about the patterns, drivers, and solutions of local issues. We have seen police forces cut their use of stops and searches in half, reduce racial disparities and treble their hit rate or their effectiveness rate when they've introduced some of these practices. Thank you very much again for having me to speak, and I look forward to hearing the discussions and your comments.
Thank you very much, Ms. Del Sol. One thing that I took from your presentation is that all people are equal before the law, and whatever discussion that follows should follow this or be aligned to this principle. Thank you very much for that. Without further ado, I would like to then invite member states to make their statements. On my list, I have the Russian Federation,
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. Today, in a number of countries, we are observing a breakout of xenophobia and racial tension. The alarm felt throughout the world is becoming worsened in the light of these phenomena and trends. And we see clearly expressed symptoms and signs of hatred and aggressive nationalism, which often limit or border on racist manifestations. In many countries, immunity concerning radical ideologies is worsening, and often there is a slogan being used of the need for respect for freedom of expression and free speech. The recent neo-Nazi demonstration in Charlottesville in Virginia have become a graphic example of the problems related to the widely embedded Afrophobia and racism that exists in the United States, and the ideology of white supremacy and other hideous and inadmissible manifestations in the 21st century. Another characteristic example is the planned racist occurrences that happened in the football match between Kiev football team, Dynamo, in the match against another team which had African players in their team. The fans came into the stadium in white clothing. Some of them were dressed in traditional clothes of the Ku Klux Klan. And also they were wearing masks with swastikas. And they opened up a banner in front of the tribune which said 100% white. Unfortunately, the world did not witness any reaction. There was not even any condemnation of what happened on the part of the current Ukrainian authorities, and also the representative of the High Commissioner's Office for Human Rights of the United Nations. Recently, we get the impression that the most important people in the world who are working in the that various public opinion officials are trying to make anti-racist activities secondary. And we would appeal to all important stakeholders in states, international organizations, and institutions of civil society and expert circles to pool their efforts to combat this common evil and to not allow any justification of racism in any forms or manifestations, and to resolutely condemn it and take every possible measure to eradicate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I now call upon the distinguished representative from Canada.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the panelists for most interesting presentations. The International Decades theme of access to justice seeks to draw attention to the often unique and serious challenges encountered by people of African descent in relation to the justice system. In many communities worldwide, including in Canada, they are overrepresented in the penal system, face alarming rates of police violence, and are the subject of racial profiling. Furthermore, all too often, people of African descent are the victims of racial and ethnic hatred and violence, yet are disadvantaged in their ability to seek redress. More efforts are needed to ensure that everyone is guaranteed both equality before the law and equal protection of the law. A key component in the administration of justice is for Canadians of African descent to have trust and confidence in the justice system. Canada's federal police force is guided by a bias-free policing policy based on the principles of equality and non-discrimination. Several divisions have also developed their own cultural competency courses to enhance cultural understanding and respect. Similar efforts are being undertaken by provincial and territorial governments across the country. In Nova Scotia, as an example, the Human Rights Commission has commissioned a study and report of 11 years' worth of policing data respecting street checks and the African Nova Scotians community. Results are expected in the fall of 2018, along with recommendations. Another note, earlier this year, the Government of Canada announced the reinstatement of the Court Challenges Program. This program will assist Canadians, particularly vulnerable Canadians, with funding for potential precedent-setting legal challenges to advance and protect their rights under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom. Canada is currently reviewing changes to our criminal justice system and sentencing reforms. Strategies and measures are being put in place to counteract overrepresentation of visible minorities in the youth criminal justice system, such as legislation, culturally appropriate programming, and continuing efforts to address socio-economic disadvantage. Merci.
Thank you very much. I will now call upon the distinguished delegate from Belgium.
Thank you, Chairman. Before talking about justice, since it's the first time I'm taking the floor, I'd like to thank, on behalf of Belgium, OHCHR for convening this regional meeting, and I'd also like to thank all the speakers. We'd also like to pay tribute to the active participation of civil society in this meeting. On justice, Belgium would like to underscore the importance of adopting, or if necessary, strengthening legislation in order to combat all forms of discrimination, including those that specifically affect people of African descent. Belgium was a pioneer in the area. At the start of the 80s, our country adopted a law criminalizing certain acts which were xenophobic or racist in nature. More recently, Belgium has ensured that its legislation is in line with the European framework to combat discrimination. Within this context, many legal appeals have been brought to the courts, and in some cases leading to not only fines but prison terms. Although Belgium has robust legislation in this area, it's clear that that is not sufficient, so that victims of ordinary racism, we want to ensure that they get proper justice. And perhaps you can have recourse to non-judicial mechanisms which can be complementary in nature to respond to victims' needs. A Centre for Equality and Combating Racism, UNIA, in Belgium is active and has been active for years now to collate and collect complaints regarding racism. It also works as a platform and a hub for analysis and research, examining trends of xenophobia and racism in Belgium. This means that public policies can be properly informed as well as decision makers. Studies have been published by this body on discrimination facing people of African descent in Belgium. There needs to be greater effectiveness in addressing these issues. What's important is that we develop better knowledge of racist phenomena affecting more specifically this group of individuals. Data collection is therefore crucial, and analysis and research is equally important, as I said. On the 22nd of November, yesterday, the King Bedouin Foundation published an extremely detailed study on discriminations facing people of African origin in Belgium, and I would invite you to consult that. This study is the fruit of a survey carried out of 805 individuals of all of African descent, and most of the respondents said that they had suffered discrimination, unequal treatment, insults, be it because of their origin or their skin color. This discrimination can happen in a range of areas, perhaps in education, housing, and work. Second-generation Afro-descendants also feel that they are closer to Belgium than their elders. Young people of African descent who have had a certain level of study but also suffer from unemployment are a particularly important body socioeconomically, very important with great potential currently. Belgium is well aware of the challenges facing people of African descent, and we will continue to engage internationally and nationally to implement the activities of the International Decade in all its 3 dimensions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. At this point in time, I would like to open the floor to civil society and other stakeholders. We have about 1 hour, 15 minutes to go. I will try and manage the time. If I can just make a request that each civil society representative speak for a maximum of 2 minutes in order to give space to other speakers. We have about 27 representatives on the list, and obviously we are not going to finish, but there will be an opportunity tomorrow to give them that space. I also want to take an opportunity to give to the panel later on, just to wrap up. On my list, the first on my list is Samuel Dewitt, Proctor Conference. Please identify yourselves, and your 2 minutes starts now.
Yes. So I'm privileged to speak on behalf of the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference. We represent African American churches across North America, as well as seminaries and institutions of higher education. So perhaps on the brink of the 3rd year of this decade, we are in this room, we're sitting at an intervention crossroad where we can invest in episodic initiatives that legislate a behavior change through adoption of new policies that massage the jagged edges of criminalization, trauma, and displacement, or we can invest in a sustainable change that reckons with the root of the hierarchy of human value. And that's what we do at the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference. We go to the root of the hierarchy of human value. We believe that when seeking justice, the government can legislate a behavior change, but it cannot legislate a belief change. And that's the power of the faith community. Social institutions are a reflection of our ideologies, and theology is one of the strongest avenues by which our ideologies are informed and shaped. So at the root of dismantling the system of white supremacy is engaging communities of faith so that we might get at the root of our ontology, we might understand how it is and what it is that we fundamentally believe about one another. So one of our strategies coming up in the next programmatic years is truth-telling commissions. We've done truth-telling commissions in the past about Hurricane Katrina, and then Senator Barack Obama wrote the foreword to our report. We've done truth-telling commissions on mass incarceration with the assistance of Michelle Alexander. And now we're going to be doing truth-telling commissions on mitigating or dismantling the system of the hierarchy of human value. So I would just add to this rich conversation this afternoon that faith communities are central to seeking justice on behalf of people of African descent. Thank you.
I would like to call upon the distinguished delegate from Italy, and then I will come back to civil society. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator, for giving me the floor. Italy aligned itself with the statement delivered by the EU earlier today, and thanks to the panelists for their presentation. Mr. Moderator, Italy remains firmly committed to fight against racism. In this regard, as a way of example, we have recently introduced new specific penal law-related provision, inter alia, to better determine whether crimes have been motivated by racial hatred. In September 2017, we have adopted the first National Integration Plan for Beneficiaries of International Protection, which identifies among priority areas of intervention issues such as interreligious dialogue, family reunification, preventing and responding to discrimination, civic participation. Mr. Moderator, to ensure a successful implementation of International Decade for People of African Descent, we would like to remark and pose the question on what specific steps could be taken, especially in light of SDGs number 16, to eradicate gender-based discrimination and to ensure effective access to justice of women and girls of African descent. I thank you.
Thank you very much. Then second on my list is Association Kwanzaa. Sorry. Please identify yourselves by
Bonjour,
showing,
mesdames et messieurs.
by raising,
Okay.
and your 2 minutes starts now.
Bonjour, okay. Bonjour, mesdames et messieurs.
Good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to be able to take the floor representing Kwanzaa, which is an association of people of African descent who are university students, and talk about racism facing the African population and people of African descent. I'd like to talk about the racial profiling that occurs. It is direct discrimination, and it targets ethnic minorities, particularly people of African descent, Africans. They are the first who are singled out. These practices that violate Spanish standards and norms, as indeed the Ombudsman has said, and indeed as has been said by ECRI, the European institution, and also violating the principles set out by the Special Rapporteur, the UN Special Rapporteur on racism. These racist practices are codified in national law, violating international standards, as has been said by Williams from the Human Rights Committee. Secondly, we have what are known as expulsiones caliente, in other words, immediate ones, taken back to Melilla and other places. And this is happening every day. We see a militarization of the borders, which has turned the Mediterranean into an open cemetery for our brothers and sisters. We would pay tribute to the many people of African descent who have been basically murdered by the racist Spanish system, and also our forebears, who, I'm thinking of Lucrecia Perez and San Martin. The struggle continues. Thank you.
Very much. I'll call upon Movimiento por la Paz. Your 2 minutes starts now.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, everybody. I am Esther Mamadou. I'm the Refugee Program Coordinator from Movimiento por la Paz, and I'm here to talk about my daily experience on the behalf of the civil society in Spain. I want to talk about the following situation. Despite the increasing cases of human trafficking and violence towards African migrants and refugees when they reach Spain, they still face detention, collective expulsion, no individual assessment, limited access to justice, and limited access to asylum procedures. Women are put at risk of being re-trafficked when deported. 15 years ago, I was welcoming migrants and refugees arriving by painting wooden pirogues from the coast of Senegal and Mauritania. Today, I welcome survivors of kidnapping, rape, torture, and other cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. They were paying 500 to 2,000 euros. Now they pay 6,000 euros. I see and I hear stories of horror. I see scars and traumatized people. The exploitation and monetization of black Africans have become a marketplace when they have become a commodity. We are seeing enslavement at the doorstep of Spain and Europe, and the methods have become horrifically violent. Chair, there are survivors of horrific abuses, and therefore they should be treated as such. Instead, the EU, including Spain, is responding to the so-called economic migrant crisis, creating more detention centers, investing more money in policing borders, and bottlenecking the migration flow in North Africa. I would like to recommend the following: to call the EU to cease externalizing responsibility and management of immigration control to African countries, which contribute to the massive human rights violation currently taking place along migration routes, and the EU member state and Spain as destination and also transit countries, because people still travel. They must ensure the full respect of their non-refoulement obligations under international law of survivors of human trafficking, kidnapping, enslavement, and torture, with special attention to women, girls. They should avoid migration detention, criminalization, and forced removal. Thank you.
Very much. I now call upon the Council des Communautés Africaines Europe Belgique.
Merci. On m'entend? Merci.
Thank you. And thank you for giving me the floor. I'm Nadine Tambouy from the African community represented in Belgium and in Europe, and also a member of the European Network of People of African Descent. I think this issue of justice cannot be limited to justice imparted in courts. We need to talk about something that affects many people of African descent, irrespective of whether they're in Europe or elsewhere, but particularly in Belgium, where we are. This is the institutional inequity and injustices, which is expressed at all levels of the administration. And everybody, of course, has to deal with this administration, be it your communal agent, your local officer, or perhaps your job center where you're trying to get work, where you're trying to get assistance. Let's say for somebody who is living with a disability or some limitation on their faculties. And I think it is in that regard, I wonder how organizations of people of African descent can help these individuals, to help them get solutions to these situations of injustice. We work with very low resources, and for Belgium, Belgium here in the UN has recognized the importance of the decade, but civil society, Afro-descendant civil society, is still waiting for the official launch of this decade in Belgium, which hopefully will allow us to work on a national plan. So I didn't want this just to be a dead letter. I think it's very important that we turn this justice into something real, a real implementation, rather, I mean, as my friend just said, we don't want this decade just to be, if you like, a blank check regarding justice, but nothing materialized.
Thank you very much. I'll call upon the International Human Rights Association. Please identify yourself, and your 2 minutes starts now.
Minorities have been working to secure the rights of historically black colleges and universities. We know that, looking at our statistics, that 85% of our medical doctors comes from these institutions, 60% of our engineers, 80% of federal judges, and 40% members of Congress, and 50% of our teachers. So we know that these institutions are vital to the education, the employment, and the development of our society. But it's under attack in terms of many of these institutions are now being defunded, and they're using the idea that this discrimination, and most of these institutions are now being integrated with those other than the community which it was intended, and we ask for assistance. We have a recommendation that historically black colleges and universities that there be develop an international cooperation core planning group, and with this core planning group to have an international body that can monitor these institutions with support and for development. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Next on my list is the Aging People in Prison Human Rights Campaign. Your 2 minutes starts now.
My name is Tyrone Morton. I was born and raised in Baltimore City in the state of Maryland in the country that you call the United States of America. I'm part of an organization called HRC, Aging People in Prison Human Rights Campaign, to free aging people, aging descended Africans who are 50 years and older, who have been locked up 20, 30, and 40, 50, and 60 years is a human rights issue. It never was justice with us. It was always injustice. Let me clarify something. If you don't understand the existential phenomena called white supremacy racism as a cultural system, then all else that you think you understand would only confuse you. Dr. Frances Cress Welsing, in her book, The ICES Papers, Keys to the Color, defined white supremacy racism as the local and global power system structured and maintained by white people who classify themselves as white, whether consciously or subconsciously determined. And this power system has patterns of logic, thought, symbol formation, behavior, and emotional response as manifested through all areas of people activity, entertainment, law, education, economics, religion, sex, and war. The ultimate purpose of this system is the genetic survival of people who classify themselves white in a world where the majority of people are black, brown, red, and yellow, who are genetically dominant, where white people are genetically recessive. So the first thing that white people historically asked themselves when they met people of color was, how do we control, how do we confine, how do we contain the melanin? So they went about the process of figuring that out. And the manifestation of all the problems that we talk about in this room comes from the core logic of white supremacy racism. And the enslavement process was the beginning of that. And the re-traumatization, when we go after, when our organization tries to help get a person of color out of prison after being locked up 40, 50, and 60 years, this system has to figure out a way from the enslavement process to the Jim Crow period all the way up to now. How do we keep a group of people submissive like they did with African people? So we had to be re-traumatized. The epigenetic process was done through enslavement. Enslavement, you hit a person at the psychological level, and you traumatize them, and you affect their emotions and their feelings about themselves. It's called the inferiorization process. And epigenetic trauma comes about. Self-alienation sets in. Self-alienation is the inability of people to exercise their individual and cultural endowments.
Thank you.
Because of inhibitory fear, because of underdevelopment, because of unawareness. And this is what occurred from the enslavement process through the Jim Crow process up to now. And today, because they usurped our culture and our identity and falsified our consciousness, we suffer from normal deficiencies.
Thank
and
you.
The solution, what is called a Negro, and there is no Negro land, there are no Negro people. So how do you, as a group of people, define who I am when my potential was given to me and my possibilities were given to me by God? The solution is African people must first analyze white supremacy.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. I will. Thank you. Thank you. At this point in time, I would like to call upon the Selma Center for Non-Violence. Please identify yourselves, and your 2 minutes starts now.
Good afternoon. My name is Ainka Jackson. I'm the Executive Director of the Selma Center for Nonviolence, Truth, and Reconciliation. We were founded in 2015 amidst the 50th anniversary of Bloody Sunday and the Selma to Montgomery March. That weekend, the KKK distributed thousands of recruitment flyers while President Obama was in Selma. We also had 2 murders that weekend in a town of less than 20,000 people. In 2014, our county was the poorest county in the state. In 2015, we were the most dangerous place to live in Alabama. And in 2016, we were named the 8th most dangerous place per capita in the country. This should not be. We believe that broken relationships have led to a broken economy and have led to broken communities. We seek to bring healing in those areas as we seek to bridge divides and build a beloved community. As a former public defender, teacher, and social worker, I have seen how all of these systems connect. And it is about the hierarchy of human value. The Kellogg Foundation has chosen Selma as one of 14 sites for the Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Enterprise. We are the programmatic lead for that work, and we are focused on healing and transforming within communities and between communities, including addressing internalized racial superiority and racial inferiority. Our board chair and co-founder, Dr. Bernard Lafayette, who was a leader in the Nashville sit-ins, the Freedom Rides, the Selma movement, and Dr. King appointed him to be over the Poor People's Campaign, said that we needed a Selma 2, which is a human rights movement. We believe that having directly affected people leading this movement is crucial. This is why we support Civil Society Recommendation 5. People who experience oppression know best what we need. We cannot be empowered. We are innately have power that can be ignited, mobilized, and resourced. We just don't want the end of racial discrimination and inclusion, but racial equity and economic equity. We believe that Selma will change the world again, and this time it can't be eliminated by the United States Supreme Court. It will be a cultural shift that eliminates the hierarchy of human value and that our laws will reflect the realization and the fullness of our humanity. This is Selma 2.0.
Thank you very much. I would like to call upon the U.S. Human Rights Network. Identify yourselves. And your 2 minutes starts now.
The U.S. Human Rights Network is grateful for this opportunity to participate in the 2nd regional meeting for the International Decade of People of African Descent. One of the goals of the decade is to fight for justice for people of African descent. We believe that this justice must include those who have suffered the consequences of the U.S. criminal justice system. This includes people who have experienced violence at the hands of law enforcement. This includes people who have experienced people who were formerly incarcerated, who are unable to fully participate in society. This also includes Black children who are forced to grow up prematurely by a system that criminalizes them even as they play. We ask that the UN provides a more effective infrastructure for people to register complaints and to monitor these issues. We condemn the US Department of Homeland Security's decision to strip Haitian immigrants of temporary protected status as of July 22nd, 2019. Given that the UN accepted responsibility for the cholera epidemic in Haiti, which slowed the country's recovery from the 2010 earthquake, we believe that the UN must take concrete steps to protect the human rights of Haitians, which includes their right to stay in the US. The U.S. Human Rights Network is appreciative of the financial support that the Office of the High Commissioner provided for civil society organizations to participate in this meeting. Given that we believe that human rights advocacy should prioritize the struggles of the poor and the most marginalized groups in society, we ask that financial support should also be given to people who are not affiliated with civil society organizations. We recommend that the UN develops an application process along with a communication strategy that civil society can amplify in order to ensure maximum participation in future meetings. We also recommend that directly impacted individuals and civil society organizations be involved in the drafting process of the new United Nations Declaration on the Promotion and Full Respect of Human Rights of People of African Descent, which we recommend naming the United Nations Declaration on the Promotion and Full Respect of Human Rights of African Peoples. Thank you for this opportunity to participate and to share our perspective on this important conversation. We invite you to continue this conversation at the U.S. Human Rights Network biannual convening, which is happening in December 7th to 10th in Atlanta, Georgia. We are looking forward to working along the UN member states, civil society, and directly impacted folk to ensure that the decade's goals are achieved. Thank you.
Next on the list is the Soul Rebel Movement. Your 2 minutes starts now. Microphone. Microphone.
Start again.
Your 2 minutes starts now.
Dear representatives of the unfree world, I stand here as a representative of Soul Rebel Movement, Nederland wordt beter en Kick Out Zwarte Piet, and an active member of the EMPAT and ENA. I come from a country that boasts about her domestic laws, her democratic values, and a respect for international laws. If I was a foreigner, I would have believed it. But I'm not a foreigner, I'm a Dutch citizen, and I can assure you that my country is a theorist and not a practitioner. Although my government has recognized the decade of people of African descent, it hasn't recognized the daily racism African people and people of African descent are confronted with in our communities, at our work, in our schools, and in public spaces. Even the most visible racism, the blackface tradition, Black Pete, is upheld by government, anti-racist organizations, and institutions. The blackface figure Swart Piet, as well as other Afrophobic stereotypes, is a symbol of dehumanization and portrayal of black people as inferior as character. Peaceful black protesters have suffered over the years from extreme police violence and ethnic profiling during the various protests requesting for the removal of racist symbols from public spaces to effectively remove the racism from the minds and heart of the people. However, this morning, the national newspaper, the AD, together with Prime Minister Mark Rutte and others, published a statement asking us to stop our protest when Zwarte Piet arrives in the country, so the children can enjoy Zwarte Piet without protest. Remind you, when they say children, they mean white children. This pattern of human rights violation of the people of African descent within our country violates EU and international law on freedom of assembly and non-discrimination. We urge you to ensure an independent investigation into the actions of law enforcement and government regarding Zwarte Piet protests and actions around systematic racism. We ask the UN to pressure the Dutch government to guarantee that future peaceful assemblies will be safeguarded and protected in accordance with international law. If not, the state will be held accountable for the actions they take against peaceful protesters. The people of the Netherlands, together with our government, must unlearn the notion that our country is free from institutional racism and start to accept the fact that we are living in a racist country, a country that does not value black lives. However, a sleeping giant cannot awake itself. We need to awake her. So the next time you visit my country, the Netherlands, please do not be blind by the fine architecture, the red light district, and the coffee shops. Please look further into the treatment of people of African descent, dissidents, Muslims, the Moluccan people, undocumented people, and the queer community who are daily met with violence and exclusion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next on the podium, next on the list is European Network of People of African Descent. Identify yourself again, and your 2 minutes starts now.
Yes. Oh, sorry. Is you? Okay.
My name is Joyce Maria Muguni. I'm from Germany and talking on behalf
Microphone, please. Microphone.
It's okay, it's okay. Okay, my name is Joyce Maria Muvuni. I'm from Germany, and I'm speaking on behalf of the European Network of People of African Descent, NPAD. The European Network of People of African Descent is engaged in the fight against anti-black racism and is for political empowerment of people of African descent in Europe and beyond. As NPAD, we call for more specialized attention to the situation of migrants of African descent worldwide. We also call upon the national governments, the regional institutions, EU, for example, and the UN bodies to reevaluate the implication and their sphere of influence with regard to this horrifying dynamics. As we've heard today by previous speakers, the recent media coverage about the slave markets in Libya is only an excerpt. It's a detail of experiences of exploitation, kidnapping, enslavement, rape, murder that migrants of African descent have been suffering from for years. So we call upon the member states, especially France, Germany, Italy, Spain, Portugal has already left, I see, to proactively seek for the particular role in ending this human rights, this crisis of humanity. And we call upon the above-named countries to revisit their engagement, to introduce legal visa processes, and to make sure to include measures of monitoring and intervention that ensure the tackling and elimination of human trafficking, enslavement of, and violence towards African migrants on any part of the road from African countries to Europe. We underline that these efforts must be accompanied by a serious, fully committed, and in-depth tackling of anti-black racism in European countries and beyond, which already hold people of African descent at an increased risk of being exposed, exploited, brutalized, trafficked, murdered by state agents, by Afrophobic groups, by racist political parties, or by ordinary society members. We note and we underline that unpaid, coerced labor of refugees of African descent without the provision of the most basic needs such as food or water, kidnapping and forced prostitution take very well place in Europe.
Thank you very much.
We therefore demand national plans of action for people of African descent with a special consideration of PAD refugees to give this urgent matter the needed attention and to assure that anti-black racism does not lead to that being crossed off of the agenda again. We therefore call the UN to pressure the national governments, and we also invite the national governments that are present to work on the elimination.
Thank you very much. Next on the list, I would like to urge speakers to please stick to the 2 minutes so that we can give others a chance to also speak. Next on my list is the Tapepuka representative. Please identify yourself and your 2 minutes starts now.
As the founder and manager of a charitable grassroots organization operational for the last 8 years in Northern England, I express my gratitude to the OHCHR for organizing this regional meeting and also enabling my participation. My name is Chawaphiwa Faith Muverengwe, and Tapepuka means rewoken. It has got a story, it's got a meaning, and it was previously called African Women Support Project. Tapepuka is a member of ENA and IDBAT Coalition, and I'm an expert on Afrophobia, and I use Afri and Afro interchangeably, acknowledging concerns raised earlier. I'm a member of the ENA Steering Committee on Afrophobia. Tapepuka was first to organize and hold an inaugural planning and training IDBAT UK North event on 25th March 2017, which was opened by Councillor Jackie Spade of Wakefield Metropolitan District Council. Since then, Tapepuka has held several one-to-one conversations with African-led initiatives and faith leaders, as well as holding a marketplace of ideas and community assets with groups of women in a bid to not leave anyone behind, while also demonstrating that there is no deficit within our communities as often portrayed in the mainstream.
IDBAD is proving to be a very useful and timely framework for small non-governmental organizations with frontline experiences of systemic, structural, and institutional Afrophobic racism, discrimination, and exclusion, among other forms of intolerance. First, as organizations that are not expected to define their own problems as they experience them, for being expected to volunteer their time, operating without financial and material resources, and often frustrated by the divisive legacies of the transatlantic slave trade and colonialism. Secondly, as trusted ports of call by affected people, grassroots organizations such as Tapepuka and others have access to heart-wrenching evidence of poor practices and poor outcomes due to rising Afrophobia, that is anti-African racism.
Thank you very much. I wish to call upon the representative from Cross Culture International Foundation. Please identify yourself, and your 2 minutes starts now.
Hi, my name is Hedy. I'm coming from Cross Culture International Foundation, Malta. We are greatly disturbed by the gross human rights violations faced by people of African descent coming through Libya, and would like to make the following recommendations. And I'm sure most of you are aware of the many lives that are lost, especially when crossing from Libya to Italy. And most of these migrants, they find themselves stranded at sea, and they are rescued, and some of them are brought over to Malta. And as a result, would like to make some recommendations. Would like to ask, if the EU would promote safe access to the asylum procedures in the European Union with humanitarian visas to the European Union. Also promote safe and orderly managed migration pathways, including but not limited to secular migration. Acknowledgement that migration is an effective and positive means of adapting to climate change, and promoting this concept within UNFCCC and related processes. We would also like to call on the European Union to cease externalizing responsibility for immigration control to African countries, which contributes significantly to the massive human rights violations currently taking place in Libya, Algeria, and Sudan, and along migration routes. The EU member states as destination and transit countries must ensure the full respect of their own non-refoulement obligations under international law of victims of human trafficking, kidnapping, enslavement, torture, and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment, with special attention to women and girls, ensuring appropriate assistance, effective protection, avoiding migration, detention, and forced removal. Thank you.
Next on my list is the SOS Racism. Please identify yourself, and your 2 minutes starts now.
Merci à tout le monde.
Thank you, everyone. My name is Mama Duba. I'm from the platform of persons of African descent of Portugal that recently sent an open letter to the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. The letter is among the documents distributed. In fact, the crux of the issue is justice. There cannot be recognition without justice. I am from Portugal, as I said, a member state of the European Union, where until now there has not been a single public initiative on the decade for persons of African descent. The European Union is totally responsible for non-recognition of Africans and blacks in Europe, and in its strategic orientations, it is not considered a political issue. The European Union has taken no specific measure to deal with the problem of persons of African descent and continues to model policies of diversity on white privilege, which is unjust. What we need are specific measures such as the collection of data, specific public policies geared towards the African descent persons community in Europe. Until Western powers realize that white privilege has been built on the marginalization of Africans, it will be difficult to do the justice that they deserve by those people. We need a permanent structure for persons of African descent that will continue beyond the decade, that will include civil society organizations. for persons of African descent in the form of a standing forum for persons of African descent to allow for effective reparation where the beneficiaries would be thus in charge of their own fate. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I call upon the representative from Central Pan-Africano. Please identify yourself and your 2 minutes starts now.
A warm salute to all you sisters and brothers. I'm Antumi Tuasije, President of the Pan-African Center Kituo One Africa in Spain. I bring to the present meeting the concerns of African citizens in Spain. One of these concerns deals with the need of recognition for our long-standing presence and influence in Spanish history for centuries and even millennia. Now we are from 1 to 2 million, but this can only be estimation as Spanish authorities have no interest on census. Despite this very important presence, institutional racism, police brutality, the blockade of social and professional and even political promotion, and a total silence over Spanish enslaving and colonial past in education and all instances are still major problems to confront. We must remember that the first recognized anti-black crime in Spain, the killing of Lucrecia Perez, was committed by a policeman in 1992. Yet today, we still have no justice for many of those died under police custody, like the mentioned Samba Martinez or Idrissa Diallo, and more specifically, the 15 victims on the Tarajal beach in Ceuta. Recognition and reparation, however, must come from all countries in all continents in which the enslavement, colonization, and racist practices have taken place, and unfortunately still are in place, like in the horrific case of Libya. Two, reparations to be fully implemented in a transcontinental perspective that may include a Pan-African passport for all African descendants, rapid, fast nationalization processes, double and triple nationality, and the possibility of easily changing the names some of us inherit from the enslaving and colonial past. Encouraging your works. Thanks for listening.
I call upon the representative from Thai International. Please identify yourself and your 2 minutes starts now. In the absence of the representative, let me call upon APP/HRC. Please identify yourself. I will.
Hello. Hello, yes. We represent Asian people in prison, Human Rights Campaign. We advocate to get people out of prison who have done 40, 50, 60 years inside North American prisons. What we are finding, we are not just in the era of mass incarceration, but generational incarceration for people of African descent in North America. We have in states like Virginia where they have 40+ prisons, 31,000 incarcerated. We have over 1,000 prisons within the United States, and now we're at the point where we have people of African descent where 2 and 3 generations of men and women are missing from their families. One of the things we would like to encourage, to suggest is that within this decade it not just be a token for people of African descent, but it actually push towards justice and the coming back together of the family of African descent, in particular those that were brought to this country to build up national, international, and generational wealth. As a result of this, people of African descent in North America and across the globe have not been able to survive and to go towards their full genetic potential as a family. So we would like this to be pushed and like justice to be pushed for families of African descent within North America. And we were asking for the immediate release of those that have done these long decades within the prisons and to be returned to their families and returned to their children, because now we have generations of children that are growing up without parents. And so we have cities of trauma across the Americas, and it is plaguing us. Thank you for your time.
Next on the list is National Monument Dutch Slavery Past. Please identify yourself and your 2 minutes starts now. In the absence of the representative, I'm moving on to Central Council of African Communities in Germany. Identify yourself. I move on to Frans Fanon Foundation. Please identify yourself, and your 2 minutes starts now.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. I would like to come back to the subject of the decade, and particularly since we're in the midst of this, to what has happened in Libya. Because if this is possible, it is because there has not been any reparation-based justice. This decade should be the time when we identify the tangible consequences of discoveries and conquests in their massive scale. They implied a collapse in approaches and a distortion of the very meaning of humanity. This is what the decade should address. These discoveries should be perceived as a metaphysical catastrophe lying at the heart of the transformation of ethics and part of the foundations of the modern approach. And modern societies were not only the worst heinous acts were committed against people, but the types of behavior used as aggression led to making war considered natural. This is what we see in terms of the slavery imposed on these young people. The process of the decade should help to identify elements in the colonial approach, to identify the material epistemological features which are visible on all levels, including the whole aspect of citizenship. It's not sufficient to think of actions for social movements and to gain the silence of African people. Rather, they should be given their voice to express their wishes, to touch others, to feel others, and to discover themselves and to open up a truly universal world. This decade should also be the time when we rethink the concept of mankind, humanity, and universality with a major legal reflection, because the history of humanity is based on a moment when millions of people were excluded from these concepts. So now we have to rethink these concepts by bringing on board and ensuring the participation of the people who have been excluded. This can only come from persons of African descent. We should also recognize that persons of African descent and Africans have skills. They are competent when it comes to talking about the law, about constitutions, about what is happening in prisons. And it is vital to take advantage of this competence because they are the prime victims and the prime experts in these fields. Thank you very much.
At this point in time, I would like to call upon the United Friends and Family Campaigns. Please identify yourself, and your 2 minutes starts now.
Good afternoon. I am here as a representative of the United Friends and Family Campaign, a coalition of families and friends of those that have died in the custody of police and prison officers, as well as those who were killed during immigration detention and in secure psychiatric hospitals in the United Kingdom. Usually the families themselves would make the following statement, but I am honoured to be representing them and bringing their voices into the United Nations at this critical international political moment to address the injustices facing African people and people of African descent in the United Kingdom, Europe and the world. The families of those that have died in custody are today demanding that the Home Secretary, Amber Rudd, convenes a special meeting between the families and those who have died at the hands of the police, and the ministerial board that has been convened to address the recommendations of the Angelini report published on the 30th of October 2017. We publicly call on the Home Secretary to respond directly to the families who feel that the government response to the issue is totally inadequate. The families of those killed as a result of police actions make the following key points. The government does not go far enough, and the recommendations they propose will do nothing to hold the state to account. It is insulting in parts and makes excuses in others. Whilst individual families contributed to the report, their views do not form the basis of the governmental response as was expected and deserved. The parameters of the Angelini report were too restrictive. It deals only with a small section of deaths at the hands of police while ignoring the majority of historic cases that result from police violence. In general, we would say that the report and its findings are not worth the paper they are written on unless meaningful action is taken. This action looks like legal aid, reopening of historical cases, a new report that to include deaths in detention centres, hospitals and secure mental health units with the contribution of families and providing of long-term resources for families and friends and communities to heal from these traumas. As a member of Black Lives Matter and a coalition of representatives of civil society organisations from the United States and various parts of Europe who are also present at this regional meeting, we write to the First Secretary, Mr. Thomas Stevens, to ensure that the goal of the decades are fully implemented with our respective countries between now and its conclusion in 2024. In our view, in order for the goals of the decade to be met, Member States must be held accountable for implementation. We offer 10 recommendations to the United Nations and its member states that, if adopted, would help ensure the goals of the decade are fully implemented. In relation to this statement, I specifically refer to point 8. Member states should address racial profiling, police brutality, state-sanctioned violence, especially the deaths of individuals in and out of police custody, impunity and lack of equality and fairness before the law, especially as it affects people of African descent, by giving the working group of experts on people of African descent extra resources to receive
I'll move on to the next speaker. I'm sorry to cut you. We are really rushing against time. The next speaker on the list is Mouvement International pour les Reparations, France. Please identify yourself and your 2 minutes starts now. In the absence of the representative, I'll call upon National Council of Churches, USA. Please identify yourself and your 2 minutes starts now. As I move, all right.
Yes. My name is Karen Georgia Thompson. I'm an ordained minister in the United Church of Christ, and I serve on the governing board for the National Council of Churches in the United States. The history of the commodification of African people, their enslavement, and the colonization of the African continent continues to be ignored as a systemic cause that impacts the current crisis facing African descendant communities globally. Across the world, there are individuals whose lives continue to be impacted by a legacy of racism and white supremacy. These notions of white supremacy have validated myths of the inferiority of African people and negated the humanity and freedom of our people for generations. Accompanying the history of white supremacy is a white Christianity that was used to bless slave ships, forcefully Christianize Africans, and provided a theological framework for slavery, Jim Crow, and apartheid. White privilege and white supremacy are on display, accompanied by Christian privilege and Christian supremacy marching in the streets of our cities, exhibiting a rabid nationalism. The National Council of Churches is composed of 38 member communions. The NCC made the clear decision to initiate a racial justice initiative that will sound a clarion call to the nation for a period of truth-telling that will impact the soul of the nation. A period of truth-telling will be launched on April 4th, 2018 on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. This event will be the entry point to critically examining the historic unwellness caused by racism, as well as the role of the church in the exploitation of Black lives and in the ongoing silence that demonstrates a historic complicity. The goal is a process of truth-telling that will lead to a long-term change and the dismantling of institutional racism. Silence is violence. Our churches and faith communities must be more involved in concrete actions that will result in changes in the government, organizations, and institutions.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I will now call upon the Comité de Observatoire des Droits de l'Homme. Please identify yourself, and your 2 minutes starts now.
Sorry, we need a microphone for the speaker, please. Well, I was thanking you for giving me the floor. Nobody is above the law. In the name of peace, tranquility, and development, all these values mean that we need to focus on justice. I wanted to talk about injustice perpetrated against migrants coming from Africa. But I think it's very important that we also talk about our own African states, where there is torture, rape, issues which are deemed to be war crimes, prisoners which are taken, MPs who supposedly enjoy immunity. This is why we are so disappointed at the failure to implement constitutions by African presidents themselves, who are supposed to be guarantors. When in Africa, presidents themselves crush the law, people are compelled to flee to other countries. When they come to the West, they come up against injustice again. What is the problem? And that we need to address the root sources, which is what we've been trying to discuss today. When in a country you have such a tiny percentage who grab the wealth of that country, leaving 95% starving, then of course they're going to leave that country and go elsewhere. And we're seeing Africans being sold at $400, $500 a head. It's an extermination. And it's vital that the UN, the EU, and other international organizations address the real root problem. Of course, we keep saying this isn't working, there are too many immigrants and migrants, but let's address the root causes. The root causes, the African presidents themselves. And I think that's where we need to tell them that they have to do their work. They have to respect their own constitution rather than trampling on the rights of their own people. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Monsieur. I'll call upon the representative from Palais. Please identify yourself, and your 2 minutes starts now.
Oui. Bonjour, excusez-moi.
Good afternoon. Yes, we can hear the speaker fine. I do apologize. I wasn't expecting to be the next speaker. Thank you for giving the floor. I'm from France. I'm here representing dozens of families in France who are victims of police violence and police crime, and particularly police impunity. French judges for decades now systematically are basically giving their law enforcement forces a right to kill, basically. Very often victims complain, but systematically these there are acquittals. I'll try to briefly tell you the story of my brother. In 2007, he was killed by 8 policemen. He was pushed to the ground, beaten, but for 30 minutes, 8 against him. He vomited and then choked on his own vomit because of the pressure that was exercised on him. There were scientific examinations carried out, but the judge quashed this. Then there was an appeal. The appeal was quashed. We are now moving towards the European Court of Human Rights. My brother's case is not a unique one. There were 19 other individuals who have been killed by the law enforcement officers. None of them were armed. So you can't say it was self-defense. None of these family members have obtained reparation. This is a criminal system. It is the state that is discriminating at the highest possible level. What can you do when you're dealing with a racist state which kills our sisters and brothers every year, every month, and nothing happens? Massar Day is one of the most recent victims in France. Massar is now in a coma. It happened on the 9th of November last. We are trying to carry out a campaign nationally to have a forced prohibition of certain techniques, particularly the sort of strangulation techniques and restraining techniques which are used in France, Germany, Belgium, and in some American states. What we want to have is official support from the United Nations so that at European level, these restraining techniques can be prohibited. And I have to say, they are only perpetrated against our people. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Next on my list is the International Organization for the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. Please identify yourself, and your 2 minutes starts now.
Thank you, Chairperson. This is a joint statement by Geneva International Center for Justice and EFORD. The current situation of racial discrimination in Europe and the North American region is especially worrying as there is a rise in racism, discrimination, and hate speech among people in the government and people of influence. Worse still, these illegal acts are rarely condemned and the perpetrators often enjoy impunity. In recent years, the media has been used as a platform to vilify people of African descent, and further such vilification has garnered more and more support, particularly due to misinformation, disinformation, and outright false information. The results of such acts lead to an escalation of the severity and spread of other human rights abuses and further perpetuate stereotypes and negative perceptions of Africans and Africa in general. Age-old ideas that have been confirmed false are resurfacing without any accountability. In light of this situation, we call on states to address and condemn this rise of hate speech, especially within the government and people of influence, and hold all those accountable. Additionally, people on the move and people escaping economic hardships and fleeing their homes from armed conflict due to corrupt governments, unjust economic and trade systems by European transnational corporations who not only destroy the environment but also commit grave human rights abuses in search of refuge in Europe are unfortunately targeted and discriminated against by authorities who are obligated to protect people. As mentioned in several accounts, police and security forces commit grave human rights abuses against people of African descent in the streets, in detention centers, and moreover are discriminated against and receive unjust sentences in courts of justice. Root causes and other indirect forces must be taken into account and adequately addressed and investigated. Additionally, disaggregated data must be collected, researched, and widely spread in an accessible manner. In order to achieve justice, education must be brought to migration and detention officers, police and security forces, as well as lawyers and the justice system. Such recommendations and best practices can be found in the Durban Declaration and Program of Action, which we recommend all states to adopt and implement. In conclusion, we ask what measures are being taken by the European region to address these issues and to integrate the work and input from civil society. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call upon ISD, Initiative SWAS Manches in Deutschland. Please identify yourself, and your 2 minutes starts now. Okay, in the absence of the representative, let me move on to each one, teach one. Representative, identify yourself. All right. Last on my list is the coalition of 18 civil society organizations. Please identify yourself, and your 2 minutes starts now.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Michael McEachran. I'm a member of the International Coalition of 18 civil society organizations here at this regional meeting from Europe and the US. We have submitted a list of 10 recommendations for participants of this meeting and its outcome document. Allow me here to highlight one of these recommendations. However, first, let us not forget that equality of dignity and rights and non-discrimination are fundamental human rights that underpin the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and all other binding international human rights treaties, and furthermore, that it is no coincidence that race is the first ground of discrimination in Article 2 of the Universal Declaration, and that there are more universal human rights instruments on race than any other ground of discrimination. Recognizing this, along with the global situation of people of African descent, it is fair to say that the very integrity of universal human rights depend on the promotion and full respect of human rights of people of African descent by member states and the UN. This brings me to the United Nations Declaration on the Promotion and Full Respect of Human Rights of People of African Descent, which the Human Rights Council has decided will become a reality. We, the members of the International Coalition here today, recommend that this declaration include Africans in addition to people of African descent, and therefore be renamed the United Nations Declaration on the Promotion and Full Respect of Human Rights of African Peoples, or in the words of the Durban Declaration and Program of Action, Africans and people of African descent. The reasons for this are that anti-black racism or Afrophobia is global in scope, and in general, racial discrimination against people of African descent and Africans cannot be meaningfully separated. An example of this is the humanitarian disaster that currently is taking place in and around the Mediterranean that particularly affect African migrants, and the discrimination across the European Union that affect Africans as well as people of African descent. At large, people of African descent and Africans share similar histories of racial discrimination and stereotyping, violation of human rights, colonialism, and brute exploitation, and continue to suffer from their continued legacies. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That concludes the list before me. At this point in time, I would like to hand back to the panelists in reverse order. I would kindly request you to comment or react to what you have heard in 2 minutes. We only have 10 minutes to our closing. So, Dr. Rebecca Delso.
Thank you. I would just like to thank everyone for sharing their experiences. It's interesting to see how widespread the experience of racial profiling is all across Europe and other parts of the world. And I'd like to re-emphasize the need for ethnic data collected by law enforcement and disaggregated by race, so that we're able to address patterns of discrimination in policing, and that police managers are then able to hold the police to account. So thanks very much, everyone, for sharing your experiences.
Okay. All right. I would hand over to Ms. Deborah Collis. Unfortunately, Mr. Tin has to catch a train, so he has excused himself. So, over to you.
Thank you. I'll just make a couple of very quick points. There's been a lot of discussion in the contributions about prison, and I think that as part of this international decade, we need to look at the prison industrial complex and who gets policed, who gets criminalized, who gets imprisoned. And of course that extends to immigration centers. Another area where there hasn't been any comment, but it's around the intersectional issue of racism, mental health, is around people who get detained in mental health settings. And that's a concerning issue for us. They're people whose liberty have been taken away. But finally, I think the most powerful contributions always are those who are the victims of violence or the families of those who have died. And I do think it would be good to have a standing forum for victims and bereaved families, because their voices really do, I think, bring home the reality of what we're talking about. And that brings me to the final point, which is around truth, reconciliation. It's about speaking truth to power and the importance of those voices in challenging the state narratives. And I think that families and victims can play a really important role in making recommendations for systemic change for the UN. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mamadou Diallo.
Okay, thank you very much.
for all the interventions. I think they're very interesting. One thing that I think is very clear is that something needs to be done. I think everybody has been saying that something needs to be done. We've had a lot of stories and narratives about injustices that black people are facing. But one thing that I thought a question that I would want you to take with you is that to think about why is it that, for example, King Leopold can kill 10 million black people and still you have a statue of him in the middle of Brussels? Why is it that 5,000 Africans can drown every month in the Mediterranean and yet you don't have a Twitter storm about it? Why is it that, you can have brutality and torture and dehumanization and enslavement of black people in Libya and yet you don't have all the members, the leaders of the world meeting, saying this is an emergency, we need to react? Why is it that you can pay reparations to the enslavers, but yet the people that are victims of slavery, when they ask for reparation, you say no? Why do we do this? That's the question we need to ask ourselves. Why are we so insensitive to the realities of black people? Why is it that a police officer in the United States can be caught on tape saying to a white woman who is stopped in the streets, when she panicked, the police officer said openly, listen, you don't have to worry, there's nothing to be scared about, because we only kill black people. Why is that acceptable for the leaders of the world? And we all see this, but yet we remain quiet and silent. The world is a dangerous place, as it is said, but not because of those who do evil stuff, but because of those who look on and do nothing. Let us not be those people. So I challenge you all that are here, both civil society and member states, to go back and make sure you do something. Thank you.
Ms. Sushoka.
Yes, only several words because we don't have a time. You brought here your different experience, and it was very interesting because you put the discussion on different levels, on your concrete, experience, reaction of the policeman, concrete judicial system in different countries. But you also put the question concerning the notion of justice, not only as a right to court, but as in a wider sense. So I think that it was very important, and in your voices, all voices, has been expressed this, what I put as a question, that there is no agreement for name normality what is not normal. That should not be called normality what is a discrimination and justice, what is a discrimination of people. And it was clearly said in your voices. And I can agree with everybody who expressed here around the panel that something should be done. And we are all determined here, not only you, but also we sitting behind the panel, determined to do something for making better the future for the people of African descent. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I'll just make two announcements before I hand over to Gay McDougall, and then later on I'll hand over to Ambassador Stevens, who is the chairperson of this meeting. Firstly, I would like to bring to your attention that we do have an expert meeting addressing racial stereotypes of people of African descent that will be taking place at Palais Wilson on Saturday and Sunday. And for those who might be interested in attending, please register with Christina on my left-hand side. And then I think what is also important is let's continue with the Twitter storm on African descent, and so that people can know what is happening in Geneva. On that note, let me hand over to McDougall to talk about some of the statements that you have made. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to say that today has been a day of really rich and impassioned statements and information that otherwise you don't hear in these elite halls of norm making. I don't want your words to dissipate in the breeze. So I'm inviting all of you to please bring your pieces of paper to me so that I can put them in the record of this meeting. Bring your statements, even if they're not well and beautifully written, it will enable me to capture more, maybe all, of what we've heard today, which has been unusual. It's been impassioned, and it needs to be recorded. Thank you.
Just to give you the, for those who are technologically savvy, the email address is decade.geneva@ohchr.org. Those statements can also be sent to that email address. And on that note, I would like to hand over to Ambassador Stevens. Because of time constraints, let me once again thank the panelists and hand over to Her Excellency. Thank you.
Distinguished delegates, you will agree that we have had a very fruitful day of discussions today. It is important that, and as I said, the rapporteur has told you that we try to capture what we have heard today so that we do not lose anything. So please send your statements, your written statements, to the rapporteur, to OHCHR, and we'll make sure that it is given due attention. The decade of African descent, as we have seen from the discussions today, has indeed served as an impetus to address the particular situation of people of African descent. We have heard today from some countries that have reported some action sparked by the declaration and program of activities of people of African descent. We are heartened by those countries that have initiated action and encourage them to continue in this regard. We are somewhat disappointed that some of the countries whom we would expect would be making statements related to the people of African descent because of their part in the history. We haven't heard from some, and we encourage them, and we do look forward to hearing from them tomorrow. We have heard the voice of civil society, the voice of our conscience, and I believe you would all agree that this OHCHR has given the opportunity for civil society to come out and come out with their voice. Some of the things they say might not be pleasant to everybody, but we think it's an important part of the process, and we would like to thank you very much for taking this so seriously and for expressing your views on this subject. We, as I said, will promise that we would have in the record of this meeting a candid reflection of some of what is being said. So on that note, I would like to inform that tomorrow we will reconvene in this room at 10 o'clock in the morning. We will continue the statements on justice. We would also, after that, quickly go through the remaining speakers on the panel on recognition, after which we would go on to the panel on development. I think we have all worked hard today. I wish you all a pleasant evening, and I would like at this point to declare this meeting adjourned. Unless OHCHR not comment? No. So the meeting is hereby adjourned.